It was a quiet Thursday night, a little past 11. The house was wrapped in that familiar late-night stillness, the kind that feels heavier when you're alone. I was in my bedroom, trying to distract myself from the emotions that had been building for 2 long years. Since Arthur passed away, the silence of the nights had become the hardest thing to bear. Every evening after 10, the memories returned, along with a deep, restless loneliness that I rarely admitted to anyone. That night, I thought I had the house entirely to myself. Then I heard the front door open. "Mom, it's Danny." The voice echoed faintly through the hallway, and my heart nearly stopped. Danny was my son Michael's best friend. He had practically grown up in our house, coming and going so often that hearing his voice there felt strangely normal. Except for that moment. Startled, I froze. Panic rushed through me as I quickly pulled the covers closer, hoping the dim light in the room would hide my embarrassment. But it was too late. Danny had already stepped into the doorway. For a brief second, neither of us moved. He stood there, stunned, while a wave of humiliation washed over me so intensely I thought I might disappear right into the mattress. "Danny, please," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "Just go." But he didn't move. Instead, he hesitated, as if unsure whether leaving would make the moment more awkward or less. Slowly, he stepped closer to the bed, stopping a few feet away. His expression wasn't judgmental or shocked the way I expected. If anything, it was gentle, concerned. "Ellie," he said quietly, his voice unsteady but sincere, "you're human. You don't have to be ashamed of that." His words caught me completely off guard. For 2 years I had buried my feelings under layers of grief and responsibility, convincing myself that certain emotions simply didn't belong to someone my age. But hearing someone acknowledge them, without judgment, broke something open inside me. When his hand briefly rested on my shoulder in a simple gesture of comfort, the fragile wall I had built around my loneliness finally gave way. That night became a moment I never imagined would happen. A moment born from grief, vulnerability, and two people standing in the middle of an unexpected situation neither of us knew how to handle. It was only one night, one moment of weakness during a time when my life felt unbearably empty. But from that point forward, nothing between us would ever feel quite the same again. Before I tell you the rest of my story, if you enjoy listening to reflections about life, love, and the complicated choices people sometimes make, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. Your support truly means more than you might realize. Now, let me begin properly. My name is Eleanor Vance, though most people simply call me Ellie. I turned 56 this year. 2 years ago, my husband Arthur passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Until that day, my life had always felt simple and complete. Just Arthur, our son Michael, and me. The three of us shared a comfortable rhythm that I believed would last for decades. Mike to his friends, had recently graduated college and started working, though he still lived at home. Then, not long after Arthur's passing, he received a job transfer to Atlanta. Just like that, the house that had once been full of laughter and noise became unbearably quiet. Even now, remembering the day Arthur died sends a dull ache through my chest. That morning had started like any other. He went to work, kissed me goodbye, and promised he'd be home early. By 3 in the afternoon, I received the call that changed everything. He had collapsed in his office. I rushed to the hospital, praying the entire drive that it was some kind of mistake. But when I arrived, the doctors were already speaking in soft, careful voices. Arthur was gone. He was only 58. After the funeral, the silence of the house became my constant companion. Every night I fell asleep alone in a bed that once held two people who believed they had many more years together. Friends tried to comfort me. Some would smile and say, "Ellie, you're still beautiful. You could start over any time." They meant well. But the truth felt far more complicated. No matter how kind their words were, the reality of being 56 and suddenly alone felt like standing in front of an invisible wall I didn't know how to climb. And so the days passed quietly. But the nights were the hardest, because in the quiet darkness, memories grow louder, and loneliness becomes impossible to ignore. My face had aged, of course, but time had been kinder to me than I expected. My eyes were still large and expressive, my nose delicate, and my lips retained a natural softness that no expensive treatment could replicate. Standing there in front of the mirror, I studied my reflection for a long moment. "I'm still a woman," I whispered quietly to myself. Yet the moment the words left my lips, a familiar wave of guilt followed. Every single day felt like a silent tug-of-war inside my heart. On one side was the grief I carried for Arthur, the man I had loved for decades. On the other was a quieter, now more complicated truth, the part of me that still longed for warmth, companionship, and to feel alive again. At night, lying alone in our king-sized bed, that conflict became even harder to ignore. The bed felt enormous now. I would lie on one side while the other half remained untouched, an empty space that seemed to echo with Arthur's absence. The darkness of the room only made the loneliness sharper, like a cold wind moving through an open window. Sometimes I dreamed of him. In those dreams, everything felt so real. His voice, his gentle smile, the warmth of his presence beside me. For a few precious moments it was as if nothing had changed. But waking up was always the cruelest part. Reality would return all at once, and the emptiness beside me would feel even heavier. On nights like those, I'd quietly bury my face into the pillow and let the tears fall, trying not to make a sound as they soaked into the fabric. Mike, my son, was busy building his life in Atlanta. His new job demanded most of his time, and though he called when he could, our conversations were usually short. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay?" he would say quickly. "I'm swamped today, but I'll call again soon." And every time, I'd answer the same way. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm fine." But the truth was far more complicated. There were so many things I wanted to tell him. How quiet the house felt. How difficult the evenings had become. But I could never bring myself to say them. I didn't want him worrying about me when he was just beginning a new chapter of his life. So I kept those feelings to myself. As the weeks slowly turned into months, a quiet melancholy settled into my routine. I still went through the motions of everyday life, but the sense of emptiness lingered beneath everything. It was the last Saturday of September, just a few days before the fall holidays. Mike had only recently moved away, and I was still adjusting to the silence that now filled the house. Around 5 in the afternoon, I finished taking a long shower and wrapped myself in a light silk robe. I wasn't sure why I had taken extra care that day. Perhaps I simply needed something to lift my mood. The soft beige fabric of the robe contrasted gently with my skin, and I tied the sash loosely around my waist. My hair, still damp, fell over my shoulders, carrying the faint scent of rose from the soap I'd used. For a brief moment, standing there in the quiet living room, I felt almost peaceful. Then suddenly, the front door opened. I turned quickly, startled by the unexpected sound. Standing in the entryway was a familiar figure. It was Danny. For nearly 20 years he had been coming in and out of our home, as if it were his own. He must have simply followed the old habit of walking in when he found the door unlocked. Oh, Mrs. Vance. I'm so sorry, he said quickly, clearly surprised to see me. The door was open, so I thought. I instinctively pulled the robe tighter around myself, feeling slightly flustered. For a brief second, neither of us knew what to say, but something about that moment felt different. Danny had grown up alongside Mike. I had always thought of him like another son in the house. Yet the way he looked at me now carried a quiet hesitation, as though he had suddenly become aware that time had passed and things were no longer quite the same. And strangely enough, my own heart had begun to beat a little faster. Danny was 36 now, working as a manager at a large company. Tall, well-built, and always neatly dressed, he had grown into a confident man over the years. But to me, he had always remained the same teenager who used to spend weekends sleeping over in Mike's room. After Mike moved to Atlanta, Danny hadn't visited as often. Life had pulled all of us in different directions. But today, it seemed he had come by simply to check in before the holidays. "Danny, just give me a minute," I said, trying to steady my voice. I hurried to my bedroom and quickly changed into a black knit top and a pair of beige slacks. When I glanced at my reflection in the mirror, I noticed my cheeks were still slightly flushed and my heartbeat hadn't fully settled. Taking a slow breath, I returned to the living room. Danny was sitting on the sofa now, looking slightly awkward, as if he wasn't sure whether he should have stayed or quietly left. The moment he saw me, he stood up quickly. "I'm really sorry," he said again, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "I didn't mean to walk in like that." "But you didn't answer," Danny added, rubbing the back of his neck as if he still felt awkward about walking in. "It's all right, Danny," I replied, forcing a small smile. "It's actually really nice to see you. Would you like some coffee?" I tried to sound calm and casual, but inside my heart was beating far faster than it should have been. I could feel his gaze lingering on me, thoughtful and observant. When I looked at him properly, I realized just how much he had changed over the years. Danny looked older, more confident. His shoulders were broader, his posture steadier, and his face carried the quiet seriousness of someone who had grown into his life. He wasn't the lanky teenager who used to trail behind Mike anymore. As I moved around the kitchen preparing the coffee, my mind kept drifting back to the moment earlier, how he had looked at me when he first saw me. It had been years since a man's gaze had carried that kind of awareness, and strangely, it stirred something inside me. It wasn't just embarrassment. There was a faint flutter in my chest, like rediscovering a part of myself that I had buried beneath grief and routine. "Mrs. Vance, you look really young," Danny said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice sounded cautious, almost hesitant. Honestly, even more beautiful than I remember. The compliment caught me completely off guard. My cheeks warmed instantly, and I turned slightly toward the counter so he wouldn't notice. "Thank you, Danny," I said softly. "And you've grown into quite the gentleman yourself." Soon we found ourselves sitting across from each other in the living room, and cups of coffee warming our hands. The conversation started a little awkwardly, but it gradually became comfortable. Danny talked about his work at the company, the long hours, the challenges he faced managing people older than himself. In return, he asked about Mike, about how I had been managing the house alone. "You must get pretty lonely now that Mike's in Atlanta," he said quietly. There was genuine concern in his voice. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Well, you're not wrong," I admitted with a small sigh. "The house feels much quieter these days." Strangely, talking to him felt easy. I hadn't realized how much I had missed simply sitting with someone, sharing ordinary conversation. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel so empty. By the time the clock reached 9, Danny stood up and stretched slightly. "I should probably get going," he said. "I didn't mean to stay this late." Oh, already? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Why don't you stay for dinner? Danny looked surprised, but then his face brightened. Are you sure? Of course, I said quickly. It's been ages since you've visited properly. That evening, I cooked more than I had in weeks. Chicken and dumplings, cornbread, and a simple green bean casserole. Preparing the meal filled the kitchen with warmth, and for a moment it felt almost like the old days when Mike and his friends filled the house with laughter. This is amazing, Danny said after his first bite, clearly enjoying the food. I couldn't help but smile. Eat as much as you want, I told him. Cooking for one person gets boring. I've really missed your cooking, he admitted. Living alone makes meals feel like a chore. His words filled me with a quiet satisfaction. After dinner, when I began gathering the dishes, Danny immediately stood up. Let me help, he insisted. The kitchen was small, and as we worked side by side, there were moments when our shoulders brushed accidentally. Each time it happened, a strange spark of awareness passed between us. It was subtle, almost unspoken, but impossible to ignore. I noticed Danny becoming slightly clumsy, his movements less certain than before. Finally, he spoke again, his voice softer. Mrs. Vance, you really are beautiful. The sudden honesty in his tone made me freeze. This wasn't the playful compliment of a family friend anymore. There was something deeper in the way he said it, something that changed the atmosphere between us in an instant. For the first time, the invisible line between us felt less certain. Danny, I began, but the words didn't come easily. Neither of us seemed sure how to continue. When he eventually left that night, the house returned to its quiet stillness, but I couldn't sleep. Danny's voice, his gaze, the warmth of his presence, it all lingered in my mind. Later, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror again. The same reflection stared back at me. Just as Danny had said, I still looked younger than my years. My posture, my features, the quiet confidence that time had not completely erased. I'm still a woman, I whispered softly. But the realization brought with it a complicated mix of emotions. Danny was Mike's closest friend. For years I had thought of him almost like another son. Feeling this way, noticing the way he looked at me, it all felt dangerously wrong. This shouldn't happen, I murmured to myself. And yet, despite repeating those words again and again, my heart seemed to be moving in a direction I hadn't expected. After that evening, Danny began visiting more often. At first, it was once a week. I just wanted to check on you, he would say with a warm smile. I worry about you being here alone. And every time he knocked on the door, my heart would give that same unfamiliar flutter. A feeling I hadn't experienced in years. A feeling that made the quiet house seem a little less empty. In the weeks that followed, Danny's visits became a quiet part of my routine. He would stop by in the evenings, often carrying stories from the outside world, things I had almost forgotten about after spending so much time alone. He talked about new movies, popular television shows, changes at his company, and the strange little trends people were following these days. For 2 years, my life had revolved mostly around the house. Listening to him felt like opening a window after a long winter. One afternoon, as we sat together with coffee, Danny studied me thoughtfully. Mrs. Vance? I know I've said this before, he began carefully, but you really do look incredibly young. I laughed softly, a little embarrassed. You're just being polite. No, he said firmly, shaking his head. You're just as beautiful as you were when I was in high school. Actually, even more so now. You've grown into an even more stunning woman. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Compliments like that had disappeared from my life years ago. Hearing them again felt like sunlight touching a place that had long been in shadow. Without quite realizing it, I began to look forward to his visits more than I should have. I started putting extra care into how I looked when I expected him. I would choose a flattering dress instead of my usual comfortable clothes, apply my makeup more thoughtfully, and sometimes even wear a touch of perfume. It wasn't something I planned consciously. It simply happened. Danny, too. He seemed different around me now. The way he spoke, the way he watched me, the subtle pauses in conversation. It no longer felt like the casual interaction between a mother and her son's friend. It felt like something else. Sometimes, when I handed him a cup of coffee, our fingers would brush for just a second. Each time, a strange spark would pass between us, brief but unmistakable. I noticed his hand tremble slightly, as if he felt it too. One evening, he arrived later than usual, close to 9. "Work kept me late," he explained, lifting a small grocery bag. "But I stopped by the store and brought you some fresh fruit." That night, I happened to be wearing a wine-colored dress. Simple, but fitted enough to highlight the shape I still carried. When Danny stepped inside, I saw his eyes pause on me for just a moment longer than usual. Our conversation that evening felt different, more serious. At one point, he looked at me quietly and asked, "Mrs. Vance, aren't you very lonely?" The question was so direct that it caught me completely unprepared. "Yes," I admitted before I could stop myself, "especially at night." The moment the words left my mouth, I felt my face burn with embarrassment. Why had I said that? Why was I revealing something so personal to my son's closest friend? But at the same time, there was an unexpected relief in finally saying it out loud. Danny's expression softened. "It hurts to imagine you being alone like that," he said quietly. There was no pity in his voice, only concern. That night, long after he left, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I could feel something inside me shifting, something deeper than simple gratitude for his company. My feelings toward Danny were slowly becoming more complicated. A few days later he arrived again, this time holding a bouquet of white roses. "These are for you," he said, offering them a little shyly. My hands trembled slightly as I accepted them. "They're beautiful," I whispered. As I placed them in a vase, I could feel his gaze lingering on me again, more intense than before. There was something in his eyes now that I hadn't seen in all the years I had known him, something undeniably personal. His visits soon became more frequent, sometimes every other day. With each meeting, the quiet tension between us seemed to grow stronger. A few days earlier, I had given him the front door code so he could receive a package for me while I was out at a doctor's appointment, and then came that Thursday night. It was close to 11. The house was silent, the lights in my bedroom dim. I had been lying on the bed, trying to escape the heaviness of my thoughts. 2 years of loneliness had been building quietly inside me. Suddenly, I heard the front door open. My heart jumped. "Mrs. Vance? It's Danny," his voice called from the hallway. "I tried calling earlier and you didn't answer. I got worried." My phone was still in the living room. Before I could react, the bedroom door opened slightly. In the soft glow of the lamp, Danny stepped inside and froze. I pulled the blanket up instinctively, mortified by the situation. "Danny, please," I said weakly, "just go." But he didn't leave. Instead, he walked slowly closer, stopping beside the bed. "It's okay," he said gently. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder, a simple gesture meant to comfort, but it stirred emotions I had spent years trying to bury. "You're human," he murmured softly. There's nothing wrong with feeling lonely? Something in his voice broke through the last of my defenses. For 2 years, I had carried my grief, my longing, my silence entirely alone. In that fragile moment, the walls I had built around my heart finally collapsed. I reached for him, and he held me. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of movement and the distant glow of moonlight through the window. Tears slipped down my cheeks, tears filled with both relief and guilt. Part of me knew this moment would change everything. And it did. After that night, the line between us could never truly be restored. Our connection grew deeper, more complicated with each passing week. Danny cared for me with a tenderness I hadn't expected, often telling me he simply wanted me to be happy. Yet whenever I was alone again, the same heavy question returned. Was this comfort, or a mistake that had already gone too far? And the more time passed, the more I realized something that frightened me deeply. Danny wasn't just comforting me anymore. He was falling in love. In the weeks that followed, the connection between Danny and me grew deeper and far more complicated than I ever expected. One quiet Sunday afternoon, he arrived earlier than usual. The moment he stepped inside, I noticed something different in his expression. There was urgency in his eyes, a kind of restless determination. "Mom," he said softly, "I want to spend the whole day with you today." Something in his voice made my chest tighten. "Danny, we need to talk," I replied. We sat down together on the living room sofa, the same place where we had shared so many easy conversations before. But this time the atmosphere felt heavier, filled with unspoken tension. "Danny," I began carefully, "I'm your friend's mother, and I'm 20 years older than you." He shook his head immediately. "That doesn't matter to me," he said. "I truly love you." The sincerity in his voice pierced straight through me. I could see it clearly in his eyes. This wasn't a passing feeling or a fleeting attraction. His emotions were real, and that realization only made my heart ache more. "But what about Mike?" I asked quietly. "He's your best friend. He's my son. What would he think if he knew?" Danny didn't hesitate. "Mike would want you to be happy." But I couldn't share his certainty. The thought of my son discovering the truth filled me with dread. More than anything, I worried about Danny himself. He was only 36, still young, with so many possibilities ahead of him. "Danny," I said gently, "you should meet someone your own age. Build a life, get married, have children, a normal, happy life." He looked at me with a quiet intensity. "You're more important to me than all of that." His words broke something inside me. This was someone I had watched grow up, someone I had once treated like a second son. The idea that he might sacrifice his future because of me filled me with overwhelming guilt. That night, he held me as if trying to convince me not to let him go. His affection felt deeper, almost desperate, as though he were trying to prove that what we shared was real. Yet, even as I rested in his arms, my thoughts were tangled with doubt. I couldn't imagine life without him anymore. But at the same time, I knew our relationship was standing on fragile ground. A few days later, Danny brought up something that shook me even more. "Come live with me," he said suddenly. "I'm serious. I can't imagine my life without you." I stared at him in stunned silence. The hope in his eyes made my chest tighten, but I couldn't answer. Reality stood between us like an impossible wall. Then, not long after that conversation, Danny arrived with news that neither of us had expected. "I've been transferred overseas," he said quietly. "It's a 2-year assignment in Singapore." For a moment, my mind went completely blank. When? I asked. By the end of next month. We had only a few weeks left. The suddenness of it left me reeling. Danny seemed just as shaken. Come with me, he urged. Singapore is beautiful. We could start a new life there. But deep down, I already knew my answer. I couldn't abandon everything I had built here. And more importantly, I knew our relationship had reached a point where a decision had to be made. Danny, I need time to think, I said quietly. After he left that night, sleep refused to come. My mind kept circling the same painful realization. Part of me believed this was fate offering us a way to end things gently, to step back before our lives became even more complicated. But another part of me felt like my heart was being torn in two. Danny had been the person who helped me survive my loneliness. He had brought warmth back into a life that had felt cold and empty for so long. Losing him felt unbearable. Then, a few days later, Mike called. "Hey, Mom," he said cheerfully. "How are things? I heard Danny's been stopping by to check on you." My heart sank. "Oh, really?" I asked carefully. "Yeah," Mike laughed. "He said he worries about you being alone. Good guy, right?" Relief washed over me when I realized he suspected nothing more. But that relief quickly turned into an even heavier guilt. The truth remained hidden. For now. As Danny's departure drew closer, I found myself thinking about the same question every night. Our 20-year age difference. What people would say. And most importantly, the relationship between Danny and my son. No matter how much my heart resisted it, I knew the truth. Ending things was the wisest choice. One Saturday evening, Danny made one final attempt to change my mind. "Please," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Come with me. This is my last chance to ask." Tears glimmered in his eyes. "What's waiting for you here?" he continued. "Just loneliness." I took a deep breath. "Danny, thank you," I said softly, "for everything. But we have to end this." He looked at me as though the words had physically hurt him. "Are you really saying no?" "Yes," I answered, forcing my voice to stay steady. My heart ached as I watched his shoulders sag with quiet disappointment. But I knew there was no turning back. Sometimes love alone isn't enough. Sometimes the hardest choice is the right one. A few days later, I found myself searching through old boxes in the attic. Among them were Arthur's belongings, letters, photographs, and memories from the life we had built together. Holding them in my hands, I realized something important. The past, the present, and the future were all standing in front of me at once, and somehow I had to find a way to move forward without losing myself along the way. Later that evening, I found myself sitting quietly with a box of old photographs spread across the table. Among them were pictures of Arthur, moments from the life we had built together. I held one photo for a long time, tracing the familiar outline of his smiling face. "Arthur, I hope I'm making the right choice," I whispered softly. In the picture, he looked exactly as I remembered him, kind, calm, and reassuring. And somehow, in that silent moment, a deep certainty settled inside my heart. Ending things with Danny was the right decision. Not just for me, but for all of us. The day of Danny's flight to Singapore finally arrived. I made the difficult decision not to go to the airport. I knew that seeing him leave would only make things harder for both of us. Instead, the night before his departure, Danny came to my house one last time. "Ah, Mom! I just came to say goodbye," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but the sadness in his eyes was impossible to hide. "Danny," I replied gently, Take care of yourself. When you arrive there, meet someone wonderful. Build a happy life." He gave a faint smile. "You stay healthy too, Mom. And thank you for everything." There wasn't much else to say. The important words had already been spoken, and the decision between us had already been made. The next morning, and Danny left for Singapore. I spent the entire day alone in the house. The silence felt heavy at first, but strangely, it also brought a sense of peace. Beneath the sadness, I felt a quiet relief. I had made the right choice. A few days later, I decided it was time to change something in my life. I enrolled in classes at the local community college and signed up for a yoga instructor course, something I had always been curious about but had never pursued before. On the first day of class, I looked around the room and noticed many students who were older than me. In that moment, a hopeful thought crossed my mind. "It's not too late," I told myself. Months passed quickly. Through dedication and effort, I eventually earned my certification as a yoga instructor. Soon after, I began teaching classes at a small yoga studio nearby. Standing in front of my students for the first time, I realized something unexpected. Helping others heal was healing me too. One afternoon after class, a student approached me with a warm smile. "Teacher," she said, "you're truly beautiful. There's something about you that doesn't seem to age." Her words made me laugh softly, but deep inside, I felt proud. The complicated chapter with Danny, no matter how painful, had helped me rediscover a part of myself I thought was gone forever. 6 months later, Mike came home to visit. The moment he saw me, he looked surprised. "Mom, you're different," he said. "You seem so much brighter." I smiled at him. "Your mom is living a new life now." He nodded, relief clearly visible on his face. "After Dad passed away, I worried about you a lot. I'm really glad to see you happy." His words warmed my heart. A year later, I took another bold step. I opened my own small yoga studio. It was a cozy space, simple but full of warmth. I decided to name it New Beginnings. On the morning of the grand opening, a beautiful flower arrangement was delivered. Attached to it was a small card. "Congratulations on your new beginning, Danny." I stood there for a long moment, quietly holding the card. In that instant, I realized something comforting. We had both moved forward with our lives. Looking back now, I know the path I walked was a dangerous one. Becoming emotionally involved with my son's closest friend was, without question, a mistake. Even today, the thought of Mike discovering the truth sends a chill down my spine. I could have destroyed Danny's future. I could have destroyed my own life as well. Loneliness can make people cross lines they never imagined crossing. But that experience also taught me something invaluable. Happiness doesn't have to come from someone else. It can come from rebuilding your own life. Today, as a yoga instructor, I dedicate my time to helping others rediscover their strength and confidence. I am no longer the lonely woman who once tried to fill the emptiness in the wrong way. Life is full of mistakes, but what truly matters is what we learn from them. And sometimes, the most important new beginnings come from the moments when we choose to change. That is my story. If you listened all the way to the end, a subscription, a like, or even a small comment would truly mean a lot to me. Thank you for being here.